All right, are you ready for this? We're diving deep into the book of Joshua today.
Oh, yeah. I love the book of Joshua.
It's packed with leadership, faith, some really epic battles. I mean, come on, what's not to love?
Exactly.
And if you're looking to, I don't know, like fortify your own faith,
Hmm.
maybe, understand what courage and trusting God really look like, well, this is the deep dive for
For
you.
sure.
We're working with some direct quotes straight from the book, plus a narrative summary, kind of weaving those together
Yeah.
to help us uncover some powerful lessons about obedience and trusting God's plan,
Mm-hmm.
even when it seems a little out there.
Absolutely. Sometimes it does. What's fascinating to me is how the book of Joshua picks up right where Deuteronomy leaves off, right? We have the Israelites, they've been wandering in the wilderness for 40 years.
Oh, yeah?
They're finally about to enter the promised
And
land,
they made it.
but Moses, their leader, has passed away.
Wow, so it's a time of massive change, right?
Yeah. Huge transition, a lot of uncertainty, and I think that makes it the perfect moment to examine those key themes that start to emerge.
Okay, so let's unpack this a little. The Israelites are on the verge of the promised land, but their leader is gone. I mean, talk about a challenging situation. What does this tell us about Joshua stepping into leadership?
Well, the first chapter makes it very clear. God himself appoints Joshua as the new leader. It's a moment of, divine selection. God really emphasizes Joshua's courage and his faithfulness. And in fact, God speaks directly to Joshua in Joshua 1.5. It says, "There shall not any man be able to stand before thee all the days of thy life. As I was with Moses, so I will be with thee. I will not fail thee nor forsake thee."
Wow,
It's powerful.
so powerful.
This direct communication from God shows the immense responsibility that's placed on Joshua's shoulders,
Oh, yeah.
but at the same time, it offers this incredible reassurance and support.
I can only imagine the weight of that expectation,
Yeah.
taking on the leadership role after Moses,
Right.
but also how powerful is that promise from God? Like, have you ever felt that weight of expectation when taking on a new challenge? Where do you turn to find that strength?
Yeah, it's a beautiful illustration, I think, of how God equips those he calls, right? He doesn't just give Joshua the task, he provides the strength, the assurance to actually carry it out. And I think this sets the stage for a story full of challenges where faith is going to be tested.
For sure. And speaking of challenges, let's talk about Jericho. I mean, this is one of the most famous stories from the Bible. It's where we see a pivotal moment. God gives specific instructions. Things like marching around the city, blowing trumpets. It all seems a little unusual, to say the least.
Yeah, it's not your typical battle plan, that's for sure. But I think that's exactly the point. Obedience is key here. The Israelites had to trust God, follow his commands, even when they didn't make logical sense. Remember, they had to march around the city for 7 days. It culminated in the walls collapsing at the sound of the trumpets. This wasn't conventional warfare. It was an act of faith and obedience.
And it worked. The walls came tumbling down. It really makes you think. How do you handle situations where you're asked to do something that doesn't quite make sense? Have you ever had a time when trusting your intuition or your faith paid off, even when logic told you otherwise?
I love the story of Jericho because it highlights that power of faith over human understanding. Sometimes the path to victory isn't through our own cleverness, but through completely surrendering to God's guidance,
Right.
no matter how strange it may seem at the
No
time.
matter how strange. Okay, so we've seen an incredible victory, but I have a feeling, I don't know, I'm sensing a but. I mean, here, does everything go smoothly for the Israelites from this point on?
Well, just like with any journey of faith, I think there are going to be stumbles along the way. And the Israelites, even after this miraculous victory at Jericho, they face a setback at Ai.
Okay.
And this is where the story of Achan comes in.
Okay, Achan. I'm ready to learn about this setback. What happened?
So after Jericho, the Israelites set their sights on Ai, which seemed like, a less formidable city. But they suffered this surprising defeat. And it turns out one man, Achan, had disobeyed God's very explicit instructions. God had commanded them to destroy everything in Jericho, except for certain items to be consecrated to the Lord. But Achan took a Babylonian garment, silver, gold, and hid them in his tent.
Oh, so he gave in to temptation and tried to hide it. Did he think he could get away with it? Didn't he know that God sees everything?
Yeah, that's the thing about disobedience, right? We might think we can get away with it, but ultimately it has consequences. Achan's sin, even though it seemed like a personal matter, had this ripple effect. The Israelites, remember, unstoppable at Jericho, they're now weakened and vulnerable because of this one man's disobedience.
Wow.
And it raises a really important question for all of us. What accursed things are we holding on to that might be hindering our own spiritual growth?
That's a tough question. but a necessary one. I think we've all made mistakes. We know that feeling of messing up. And the story of Achan reminds us that disobedience has consequences, but it also shows the importance of confession, forgiveness, and seeking redemption.
You hit on a vital point. Once Achan confesses and those stolen items are removed, the Israelites are able to regroup. They successfully capture Ai, this time through a strategic ambush. And I think it's a reminder that while we need to own our mistakes, God's grace and forgiveness are always available when we turn back to him.
So there's hope even after a setback. That's such a powerful message. But I am curious, this victory at Ai, was it just about God's forgiveness paving the way, or was there something more to it?
It's a great example, I think, of how faith and strategy can work together, right?
Okay.
The Israelites trusted in God's guidance after dealing with, the sin of Achan.
Right.
But they also use their own skills and intelligence to devise this plan that leads to their success.
So it's not just about blindly trusting, but also using the gifts and talents that God has given us.
Exactly. It's about finding that balance between faith and action, divine guidance, and human effort.
I love that. So this is where we see the Israelites becoming more established in the Promised Land, right? What happens next? Do they finally get a break?
Well, remember all those neighboring groups, the ones who were kind of terrified of the Israelites? They decide to team up and try to stop Joshua and his army.
Here we go again. More battles.
But this time, we see the theme of God's faithfulness and protection play out in this incredible way.
Okay.
But before we get to the battles, there's this interesting incident with some clever diplomats we need to talk about.
Ooh, okay. Clever diplomats. Tell me more.
So the Gibeonites, they'd heard about the Israelites' conquests, and they knew they couldn't win in a straight fight. So they came up with a plan: pretend to be ambassadors from a distant land and trick Joshua into making a peace treaty.
So they basically pulled a fast one on Joshua.
Yeah. They were pretty convincing, actually. They showed up with these worn-out clothes, moldy bread, even cracked wineskins, to make it look like they'd traveled a long way.
Wow.
And the Israelites, unfortunately, didn't consult God before making the treaty.
Oh, no. That seems like a big mistake.
It was. But even in this human error, God's faithfulness is still evident. When 5 Amorite kings attacked the Gibeonites, the Israelites were obligated to defend them because of the treaty.
Wow. What a difficult position to be in. They made a promise, even if it was based on a deception. What happened next?
This is where the story gets truly epic. God actually fights alongside the Israelites, sending hailstones that just devastated the Amorite army. And get this, to give the Israelites enough time to win, Joshua asks God to stop the sun in the sky.
Wait, stop the sun, like literally stop the sun.
Literally. According to the book of Joshua, that's exactly what happened. It's a remarkable example of God's intervention and his commitment to those who follow him. It also shows us that his plan is always bigger than our limited understanding.
It makes you think about those times in life when you feel like something bigger than yourself is at play, Have you ever experienced a situation where, despite making a mistake, you felt protected or guided in an unexpected way?
The story of the Gibeonites, even with the deception involved, really points to that incredible power of God's faithfulness and his ability to work even through our mistakes.
That's powerful. Okay, so the Gibeonites are safe, the Amorites are defeated, and the sun is, I guess, back to its regular schedule. What happens next?
Well, before the Israelites can truly settle, there's the important task of dividing the promised land among the 12 tribes.
Right.
This was God's promise to Abraham way back when, and now, generations later, it's being fulfilled through Joshua's leadership.
It's amazing to think about that long-term vision, God's promise made so long ago is now becoming a reality.
It really speaks to God's faithfulness, doesn't it? Even though Moses, who received that initial promise, is gone, God's plan continues. And this division of the land, it's not just a practical matter. It symbolizes inheritance, God's provision, and carrying on this legacy of faith.
It's so powerful, that idea of legacy. It makes you think about the impact of our actions, the inheritance that we leave behind, both tangible and intangible.
Exactly. We're part of a much larger story, one that began long before us and will continue long after we're gone.
Speaking of continuing the story with the land divided, does Joshua finally get a break?
Not exactly. As a leader, there's always more work to be done. Joshua continues to guide the Israelites, preparing them for future challenges. And as he gets older, he delivers a series of farewell speeches, reminding them of God's faithfulness and urging them to stay strong in their commitment to him.
I imagine those speeches were pretty powerful, especially coming from someone who'd led them through so much.
They are. Joshua recounted all that God had done for them. the battles won, the land given. He emphasized that their success wasn't through their own strength, but by the power of God working through them.
It's like he was saying, don't forget what God has done for you and don't take it for granted.
Precisely. He also stressed the importance of following God's laws and staying true to their covenant with him. He warned that turning away would have consequences.
Yeah, it sounds like a message of both love and warning,
Mm.
urging them to remember their identity and the source of their strength.
That message resonates even today. It's a call to remember who we are in God and to live in a way that honors him.
So Joshua is giving his final speeches, imparting wisdom. Did he do anything else to make sure the Israelites remembered their covenant with God?
He did. In Joshua 24, we see one of the most significant events, the renewal of the covenant at Shechem. Joshua gathers all the tribes and reminds them of their history, from Abraham's journey to their escape from Egypt and their conquest of the Promised Land.
It's like a highlight reel of God's faithfulness throughout their entire journey.
And then he gives them this powerful challenge. He says, "Choose you this day whom you will serve." He was reminding them that faith is a personal choice, a decision that each individual has to make.
That's a powerful statement. It seems like he was really emphasizing the importance of personal responsibility when it comes to faith.
Exactly. He'd led them to this point, but ultimately the choice of who to follow was up to them.
How did the Israelites respond to this challenge?
They publicly declare their commitment to God, vowing to serve him and obey his voice. It's a moment of unity, resolve, a powerful declaration of their faith.
Wow, what an incredible display of unity and commitment.
And to kind of solidify this renewed covenant, Joshua sets up a large stone under an oak tree near the sanctuary. This stone would serve as a witness to their commitment, a physical reminder of the promises they made to God.
A physical representation of their promise? That's a pretty powerful image.
It speaks to the importance of making our faith visible and living in a way that reflects our commitment to God. What stands out to you about this renewal ceremony?
Yeah, it's amazing to think about this, physical reminder of their commitment to God. Makes their faith so tangible. But beyond these physical signs, I feel like there's another aspect of the book of Joshua that we haven't really touched on yet, right? This idea of spiritual warfare.
Oh, absolutely. While we've talked about those battles and leadership, there's a whole other dimension at play in this story. It's not just about physical enemies.
Right, it's about confronting those unseen forces
Right.
that influence our world.
Okay, spiritual warfare. I'll admit, this can feel a little intense, like, something out of a fantasy novel or something, with demons and dark lords.
Right, it can seem very abstract, but the book of Joshua really shows us that spiritual warfare is real,
Yeah.
right? It's about recognizing our struggles.
Yeah.
They aren't just against, flesh and blood,
Yeah.
but against these spiritual forces as well.
So there's this unseen battle happening alongside the physical one. It's like, what? Like a cosmic chess game with much higher stakes.
I love that. That's a great analogy. And we see this throughout the book. Remember when the Israelites crossed the Jordan River and the waters miraculously parted, allowing them to just walk across on dry ground?
Yeah, it was like such an amazing display of God's power. It really felt like he was saying, I'm with you, I'm making a way. Right, but I think there's a deeper meaning there too. The parting of the Jordan wasn't just a physical event. It was this symbolic act of breaking through a spiritual barrier, right? The Jordan represented that transition from slavery to freedom, and God was breaking the power of those spiritual forces that had held the Israelites captive.
So it was a spiritual breakthrough as much as a physical one.
Exactly. And this theme continues throughout the book. Think about the fall of Jericho, right? They marched around the city, blowing trumpets, and then with a shout, the walls collapse. I mean, it defies all logic and military strategy.
It definitely felt supernatural.
Right. And the fall of Jericho wasn't just this physical victory, it was a spiritual one. Those walls represented spiritual strongholds. And by following God's instructions, the Israelites were engaging in spiritual warfare, breaking down those strongholds in the unseen realm.
So even the trumpets and the shouting, that was all part of this spiritual battle.
Yes, and this understanding of spiritual warfare really helps us interpret other events in the book, like the defeat at Ai, for example. That was a direct result of Achan's sin, right? His disobedience created the spiritual vulnerability that allowed the enemy to gain a foothold. It was only after he confessed and the stolen items were removed that the Israelites regained their spiritual strength and were able to achieve victory.
It's like a reminder that our choices have spiritual consequences. Sin can create these openings for negative influences. But repentance and obedience can restore our connection with God and empower us to resist those attacks.
That's a powerful insight. And this idea of spiritual warfare, it's not just for, biblical times. It's
Yeah.
something we face today. The Apostle Paul talks about putting on the full armor of God, standing against the wiles of the devil. He understood that our struggles often go beyond the physical.
So how do we engage in spiritual warfare today? Are we supposed to start like carrying trumpets and marching around our problems?
Well, while I appreciate the visual, I think the principles remain the same. It's about aligning ourselves with God's will, submitting to his authority, resisting temptation, putting on that armor of God, truth, righteousness, peace, faith, salvation, the word of God.
So it's more about an internal posture of faith and obedience than, outward actions.
Precisely. It's about cultivating a heart and mind that's aligned with God and then living a life that reflects his will.
As we wrap up our deep dive into the book of Joshua, what's the key takeaway you think for our listeners?
The book of Joshua reminds us that we're not alone in our struggles, right?
Right.
God fights for us, he empowers us, he leads us to victory. But it's also a call to action, right? To stand strong in our faith, engage in that spiritual warfare, and to live in a way that honors God.
It's a story full of epic battles, powerful lessons, and these timeless truths that are just as relevant today as they were thousands of years ago. You've journeyed with Joshua through leadership challenges, military victories, and ultimately life devoted to God. I mean, there's so much to unpack here.
The book of Joshua repeatedly shows God's faithfulness in fulfilling his promises. So, what promises are you holding on to today? And how can you strengthen your own trust in God's plan?
We've only scratched the surface here. But if this deep dive has sparked your curiosity, grab a copy of the book of Joshua and discover even more. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the book of Joshua.